Hello, and thank you so much for joining this conversation today. My name is Jason Bauer-Clapp. I use he, him pronouns, and I am the Associate Director of Advising and Programs at Smith College's Lazarus Center for Career Development. That's the Career Center here at Smith College. I'm really pleased to be joining you, and I want to say thank you to the planners of this conference and the Lewis Global Studies Center at Smith for inviting me to present at this. So it's great to be here. And during today's session, I want to just really share some ideas with you all about how to think about developing a CV for international audiences, no matter where you may be thinking about going, no matter where you're interested in going, and really share some ideas, share some resources for ways to think about this. And really my hunch is most of you who are tuning into this conversation probably already have a resume of some form, which is great, but certainly if you do not, or if this is resume is kind of not really familiar to you, that is absolutely okay too. So there's no sort of prior level of knowledge or completed resume you have to work with this session. So we'll lead off with that. And again, just a reminder, this session is being recorded. The recording is going to be made available on the conference website. It sounds like hopefully within maybe a week or so. As we go through, you are welcome to keep your cameras on if you'd like to do that. If you'd like to keep them off, you're welcome to do that, whatever you're most comfortable with, whatever works best for you. I'm going to do my best to monitor the chat here for questions or if there's any point of clarification that would be useful as we go. Please feel free to jump in with this. Okay, with that, let's see if I can move ahead here. All right, so another thing, maybe this is something for the chat here. Before we even get into the mechanics of a CV, let's stop a minute and let's just think about this big question of what is the point of a CV or a resume? What's the goal? What is the intention of this whole document that we're all talking about today? So if you have some ideas, again, feel free to pop those into the chat. I'd love to hear your response to this prompt. Any ideas? Get a job. Yep. Market yourself. Yep. Keep coming. What else? Give employers a brief understanding of who you are. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Secure further interest and an interview. There we go. Yeah. All true. Absolutely. Share how your experiences and interests align with whoever you're sharing it with. Yeah. Let's see if we get one or two more ideas. These are all great. And I think they're spot on analysis of how to think about this. And I tend to think of this as just really sort of practical terms as well of, look, if this works well, what does that mean? And ultimately, in most cases, a CV or a resume, it's part of the process of getting hired, but most positions, you've got to get a conversation started first. Okay, so in other words, to get an interview, it's really, really rare. Even if you have a fantastic CV or a fantastic resume, it's really, really rare that you're going to send that and the organization is going to get back to you and say, you're hired. When can you start? It doesn't work like that. So it's useful to keep this in mind because sometimes it allows you to kind of manage expectations with what you need to accomplish with this sort of document. And it's not necessarily to provide every possible bit of information that might be useful to impress them and to show them how fantastic you are, and they would be foolish to not hire you on the spot. It's to get the conversation going. And that's a really important point to keep in mind as we go through this. Okay, so as you're kind of thinking about this, really do try to keep in mind, number one, what does my audience need to know? Okay, you're not going to be submitting a CV without any context for the role for the organization. So really trying to put yourself in your audience's shoes in a way to think about, okay, based on what I know about this opportunity, whether it's an internship, whether it's a job, whether it's a fellowship, based on what you know about the host organization or the employer, think about what are they really looking for. And this is a great exercise to do whenever you look at a job description or an internship description, is not just sort of read it in very literal terms, but also just to step back and say for yourself, based on what I'm seeing here, what does it seem to really boil down to? What's the gist of what they seem to be valuing? That can give you some good grounding points for how to approach your own application process. And then, of course, really more relevant to this conversation today is also, what does my audience expect in terms of format? How should this thing look? So that's what we're going to be talking about more today. Okay, so this is a little confusing because we've got these phrases, these terms that we talk about. We got to talk about a resume and a CV and the other kind of CV, and you might be thinking, well, what is he talking about? What's that all about? And so sometimes it feels like a sign, some language that looks familiar, but something isn't quite clear. Okay, so let's start and just kind of break this down, and I'll offer you my perspective on these concepts and what they might mean, and that's going to give us a good foundation to move forward. So the resume, which probably many of you are familiar with, many of you may have some version of this. This is the standard document you're going to use for internship or job applications in North America. This is the term that we use for this. And really for most undergraduates and even for recent graduates, it has really evolved that one page is the norm, is the expectation, with the understanding that one page may not capture every single thing that you've done, and that is okay. It's meant to be selective. Really focused on things you've been doing recently, things you're doing now, focusing on your education, can include jobs, can include campus organizations, can include volunteer. All those different types of things may be part of the presentation that you're making. And really what you're doing is using those experiences, to provide evidence for your skills, your knowledge, and your abilities, right? Show, don't just tell, okay? And again, you're trying to sort of curate and be selective, ideally, based on what you know about your audience, what they're looking for, what they need. So then if we talk about a CV, and so when students come to me and say, I'm going to apply for this position, I need a CV, oftentimes my first question is, first of all, where are we talking about? Because that's going to give us that context here. So typically in US, Canada, CV, we are talking about the academic scholarly document, a professional history, record of scholarly output used by faculty, by academics, by researchers. This is the typical use for the term here in the US and in Canada. So publications, teaching, advising, service work, grants, this type of stuff. This is what we're typically talking about. And this is the kind of thing that can be as long as it needs to be. Certainly, some people in academia may have extensive CVs, okay? But moving ahead, this is not really what we're talking about for international purposes. Outside of North America, CV is really oftentimes used interchangeably with what many of us will know as a resume. It's more selective, it's more curated, it's more of a limited type of thing. 1, maybe 2 pages is the norm, depending on where we're talking about. And again, like the resume, we're focusing on current and most recent, most relevant types of things: education, work, organizations, volunteer, those sorts of things. And by relevant, sometimes this raises a lot of questions of, is this relevant? Is this not relevant? Sometimes a good way to assess that for yourself, if you're trying to decide whether an experience is worthwhile to include on a CV or resume, is to do the thought experiment of, if you include this experience and you get an interview with an organization, and your interviewer says, I see that you've included this on your document. Help us understand why you're sharing this with us. What did you think was important for us to know through this experience? Okay, this is a really good thought experiment, because if you imagine yourself in an interview and you can really make a clear connection and you can talk about that comfortably, okay, then it's relevant. Versus if it's an experience that you might say, well, I did it, kind of glad it's done, and I really can't tell you much more than that. Certainly that's an awkward moment in an interview. That may give you some insight into perhaps it doesn't need to take up much, if any, space on a CV or a resume. So I hope that prompt is useful for you. And again, we're really using the idea of showing these experiences to show your knowledge, your skills, and abilities. And ideally, you are curating, you're being selective based on what you know about the audience and what they need. So there's going to be a lot of similarities here between a CV for an international audience, no matter where we're talking about, and what you may be familiar with. So certainly, if they don't know who you are and how to get a hold of you, they're not going to be able to get a hold of you if they want to. So you need to have your name, you need to have your contact information. It's common across the board here of using sections to separate out experiences by category. Education, maybe it's relevant experience, maybe it's work experience, maybe it's leadership and extracurricular activities, maybe there's a skills section. This is going to vary quite a bit based on your own experiences. Certainly, I think for everyone on this meeting, education is going to be a significant category, probably going to be the first category. But then after that, categories may vary a bit based on what you've been up to and what you want to highlight. Within sections, though, within experience sections, it really is the norm to list in reverse chronology, meaning current or most recent experiences come first, and then you work back in time. And it really is standard practice for any experience that you've had. List who you were working for, the name of the employer or the organization, where they were located. And if it was a remote role, you can indicate remote. That's something that we all now know, where maybe it wasn't as familiar for many people, perhaps 12 months ago, for obvious reasons. Your role, your title, how long you've held that role, and oftentimes providing some descriptive information about what you did in that role. Okay, so these are really, really standard, regardless of whether we're talking about a CV or a resume. And when you go into describing experiences, whether it's a campus job, whether it's involved in extracurricular or a community organization, whatever it may be, internship, research, oftentimes the descriptions of what you did are the most helpful for your readers. So it's not just the title and the organization, though sometimes that can be really important too, of course. But the descriptions are where you make this inclusive for your readers who may not know what that role is all about. So you're really trying to show what you did, what you helped to make happen, what you contributed to. And that's why I have this first bullet point here of a good description for an experience isn't just saying, here's what I was responsible for. Oftentimes bullet point descriptions will have that, but when you can push that a little further and try to show what did you achieve, what was the outcome, what did you accomplish, not just what were you tasked with, that can be really helpful, and it can be more persuasive, more meaningful for your audience. And it's good to provide some metrics when it makes sense. Quantify when you can. How many, how often, how much, kind of gives your readers a sense of scale or scope. Obviously, there's some things that do not translate to quantification, so don't force it. But when you can, when it makes sense to do so, I would encourage you to do that. There's something about numbers that is more concrete, again, more relatable, okay? And again, it really is standard across the board globally of any descriptive statement. You're leading with a verb: developed, created, wrote, led. Certainly you can find lists online quite easily for active verbs for resumes or CVs. In contrast to using descriptive language that would say, my responsibilities were, or my duties included. That introductory, that transitional language really has really faded away, I think, over the past years. So active voice, lead with verbs. Related to this, I was just thinking about what's an example. What could this look like in terms of accomplishments? So this is a framework that might be useful for you as you're thinking about ways to describe experiences. This could be useful for a resume as well as a CV for audiences outside of North America. So the framework is basically, what was the accomplishment, or what did you contribute to? And then how did you do that? So this example, just kind of a basic demonstration of this, grew student newspapers' active writing staff by 20%. So that was the achievement. It's quantified. And then what did this person do to help make that happen? So it's a lot of data there, provides a lot of information for a reader to appreciate not just what was the result, what was the outcome, but what were some specific things that this person did to help make that happen. Okay. Consistency of style and formatting, pick a font and stick with that font. If you're gonna use bold face for experience titles, use that consistently throughout. If you're gonna put date ranges towards the right side of the page, use that consistently throughout. You sort of train your readers towards the top of the page of how you're gonna present information. And then the more that you can follow that, the easier it is for them to really engage with your content. Multi-column formats. So oftentimes you'll see this, there's a lot of templates out there that you can find for resumes and CVs, and a lot of them visually, design-wise, can be quite striking. But there are a lot of templates where they use multiple columns, some text kind of organized towards the left of the page, some towards the right. But sometimes the visuals overwhelm the content and may make it more confusing. They may not be the best use of space. Simplicity, clean, smooth, easy to read is really what you're going for. You want format to serve the content, not vice versa. And the other issue with multi-column formats is that, especially for larger employers that may be using resume scanning platforms, they're often known as ATS tools, applicant tracking software. Those don't always handle multi-column resumes or CVs really well. They can really confuse the text readers there. So just be cautious of that. Use clean fonts, Times New Roman, Arial, Calibri, Georgia, things that are just professional, clean, easy to read. A lot of resumes and CVs that I see are 11 point for their main text size, maybe a little bit larger for other categories. I've seen these documents maybe go down to 10 point. I wouldn't go any less than that. And my suggestion here is to really use, if you're going to emphasize something, bold tends to be easier on the eyes than underlining or italicizing. Just a little bit cleaner overall. Presentation-wise. All right. Ruby, thank you for that question.
Go ahead.
Perfect. Nailed it. So, so page size. So North American standard page size, paper size, 8.5 by 11. Most other places in the world actually is a slightly different standard paper size, page size, which is known as A4. It's a little bit narrower. It's a little bit taller. So you'll need to do some investigation to see what is the standard expectation for where you're going to be applying, and be mindful of that piece for sure. Within Word, you can go into the page layout menu, and there is an option for A4. If you're using Google Docs, it's in page setup. If you're using another tool for that, there's going to be another sort of page format, page layout tool that should have A4 built into it as well. So you'll notice that if you have a resume that's formatted for 8.5 by 11, you switch the page size to A4, things might get squished a little different. You'll have to play around with that, but just be mindful of that, of standard page size is not totally standard, okay? Another thing that can feel very different and unusual if you're not familiar with it is in many parts of the world, it is standard practice. It is expected to include data like your birth date, your marital status, or perhaps even a picture. Whereas in the US, typically those types of things are not, should not, be included at all. So again, you kind of have to know what are the local expectations, regional expectations for that. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about some ways to find that out. Okay, so you just have to be familiar with what are those expectations and just adapt to that. Okay, in terms of the length, again, it's not necessarily the more the merrier with things. Most countries, sort of the standard professional CV is 1 to 2 pages. In some places, there's a really strong favoritism towards 1 page. Other places, the length is a little bit more flexible depending on a person's experience. Again, so you have to be mindful of that. And even the formality, the level of detail, again, it's going to be tied to the length issue. If it's kind of norm and expected, comfortable to go to 2 pages, that gives you a bit more space to offer more detail. Certainly, this is going to vary a lot too, depending on your particular industry, the types of roles that you're seeking, and what sort of detail you might be thinking about. Someone who is in a research-intensive field may want to offer some more specifics about tools, techniques, practices that they've used through lab work or something like that. Talking about more like a STEM research or quantitative research or whatever it may be. So again, it's both kind of country specific, but also industry specific. And then the standardized categories or the variable categories relate back to this idea that I was sharing a few minutes ago of sometimes it is just really standard of education, work experience, skills and training, no matter what field the person is in. And sometimes it tends to be a bit more flexible in terms of using categories based on your own experience, based on your own career direction and intended trajectory. Okay. Really, in the US, the notion of including an objective statement on a resume has really fallen out of favor. This used to be really, really common. These days, most employers tell us we don't need that, we don't want that. If you're going to talk about career goals, it's maybe more likely to include in a cover letter. Don't really bother with a resume, use the space for other stuff. But that's not necessarily true everywhere. There are some countries where some sort of career objective, some sort of career goal thing is comfortable, is common, is accepted and appreciated on a CV. So again, there's a lot of differences here. There is not a one-size-fits-all approach to this. So what I'm going to do, just as an example, I'm going to take you through some snapshots here of different versions so that you can see some of these similarities and see some of these differences in action. I recognize, depending on the screen size that you're looking at, the details of each of these documents may not really resolve so well for you. And that's okay. The point here isn't necessarily the specific details. I want you to try to pay more attention to the overall structure and format, the look, the feel of these documents, more so than the specific text itself. Okay, this first example, actually, this is from a student I worked with at Smith a few years ago, and I do have her permission to use this and to share this, who was applying for internship in Geneva. So this is an example of expected to include a headshot for this. In the upper right corner, you can see there's a personal data section here where this particular student would have shared more of that information. Certainly the language skills are quite important here, for any sort of multilingual setting. Showing your language skills and proficiencies are going to be critical, of course. And then we've got education, we've got professional experience, we've got leadership experience. So this is one example of a format that would have been appropriate, acceptable, and kind of expected for someone who is looking in Geneva. We got a question that just came in through the chat. Some examples or suggestions for writing a career objective statement. So my recommendation for something like this is almost similar to what you might use if you are writing your introductory sentences in a LinkedIn profile, the About Me section, but maybe a bit more specific for that. Certainly you want to do a career objective statement that is in line with your audience who you're sharing this document with, right? You don't want to give a career objective that is totally different than the role you're applying to. That's going to raise some questions. But also specific. There used to be this sort of standard vague language, seeking a challenging position where I can utilize my skills and expertise in collaboration and data and statistical analysis. That's really broad, that's really vague, that doesn't really tell me where this person is going. So, seeking opportunities in environmental sustainability and public engagement, or something like that. Something that does offer a little bit of a sense of what are you looking for short and long term professionally? What kind of work do you want to be doing? And think about it more in terms of not what's the title of the role, but more what's the actions, what's, thinking of job as a verb, not necessarily a noun. 1 or 2 sentences is fine. Basically a way in really, really short form to tell your reader, here's the direction that I want to go. So that's kind of a very basic background on that. Certainly many of these documents, you're going to be accompanying it with some sort of cover letter or introductory message in an email anyways, where you may unpack this idea a bit more deeply. Okay, so just, for comparison's sake, here's an example of a document for someone who might be seeking roles in South Korea. Example here, if you can see more closely, this is someone who includes education and qualifications. They have personal information. South Korea is a country where some employers will request a lot of data, including a headshot and more personal data. Some employers may not. Kind of depends a little bit on if it's kind of a global employer that has a footprint in many different places, or if it's more country specific. But you can see a lot of things. They've got education, they've got their employment history, they've included a hobbies or interests activities section, and a little bit of a personal profile at the end. So, a place where learning a bit more about this candidate, and not just what they've done, but who they are, what they're interested in, kind of the way of working, is a bit more common for applications here. Compared to United Kingdom, okay, where a 2-page CV is pretty common. It's okay, even for people who are very early career. You can see in this example, this is someone who does have a master's level degree as well as a bachelor's level degree. Again, don't worry so much about the specific educational level, but more think back to the kind of the bigger the overall layout and framework of this document, and use that as maybe some grounding for how you might think about this. They've included a summary section here with some bullet points, just really boiling down, here's what this candidate has been up to here's some of their background, and then going into their specifics, both education and someone who seems to be really focused on doing accounting financial work. So they emphasize that, and then a broader sense of their employment history beyond accounting specific types of things. All right, we keep going. So if we look to a country like Chile, just through some of the investigation there, that's a document that is very, very similar to what might be standard for a US resume. Some interesting things about employment application rules there is that technically companies, employers are not supposed to ask personal information, sort of it's against the labor laws, and yet it still seems to be a holdover that some companies may do anyways. So again, you may kind of have to navigate that of if you're looking for a position there, and if you see that request, how do you want to handle that? Do you want to just depart with that information? So again, you may need to think about that, and we'll talk again about that in a few minutes as to ways you might explore that. Okay, but this format probably looks pretty familiar for those of you who have used a resume in the past. Education, work experience, assistantships. Again, this is for someone who's done graduate level training, so the assistantship section makes sense there. And I think maybe just one or two other examples. Again, not meant to be an exhaustive list of if you want to try to get an internship or a job in South Africa, here is everything you need to know. But more just, I wanted to show you examples of how this is done in different parts of the world, so you can see what looks familiar, what seems to be pretty consistent, and what are some differences. So South Africa, they include, curriculum vitae at the top, as well as the person's name, address, background information, educational qualifications. They're using the term tertiary education, meaning post high school types of work, and then secondary education. So they're going a bit further back in time, education-wise, as well as experience, right? So it's a little different feel to things, and yet a lot of similarities there with how to present. And let's see if I have one more example. I think so. Yeah. So China. So we've got a general personal information section, again, birthplace, contact information, those types of things, education. Again, like we've seen, I think on every single one of these examples, education is really playing a leading role. And again, as a current student or even a recent graduate, education is going to be kind of a primary category to emphasize there. For most of you on this call, probably this has been your main role is student for quite a long time. So of course you want to devote lots of real estate on your document to that experience. And then this person included work experience. And again, you can see those bullet points, developed a new loan collection strategy, initiated, improved, created, and implemented, right? So those bullet points, those active verbs, all those types of things. Okay, so I hope this is useful just to kind of see some examples. Obviously, I cannot go country through country and region through region and do this. It's simply not a scalable thing for the time that we have here today. But I wanted to just let you see some of what this could look like in different parts of the world. Okay, so how do you find out what are the specifics for where you might like to be? And there's a number of ways to do this. And one of the first things that I would suggest to you is to find people who are on the ground where you want to be. Okay, and oftentimes a really good tool for this, a really good way to approach this is to perhaps start with alumni from your institution. And depending on where you're at school and the process for that, there may be a number of different ways to identify those people, perhaps through your career office or alumni office or whatever the process may be. What an amazing thing to be able to reach out to someone who lives and works where you would like to be and to establish a connection with them, to both talk with them about their experience, by the way, oftentimes if you're doing some outreach and some networking, remember that people often like to talk about themselves if they're invited to. Use this to your advantage. So oftentimes an entry point to a conversation with someone is to ask them about them and their experience. But certainly to disclose that, this is where I'm at right now, but I'm looking for internship opportunities, or I'm considering moving to your country where, after I graduate, and I'm looking for advice and suggestions for how would I approach a job search there, okay? Because, if you can make contact with people who live there, who work there, they may give you some really good nuanced information that you're not going to be able to get through any other means. And of course, they may also be useful resources for your job search too. So start with that. The next place that I would think about, and I recognize that maybe not everyone on the call has access to this. I'm going to guess that many of the institutions that are represented here today have Going Global, have a subscription to Going Global or something very similar to it. So if you're not sure, maybe check with your own college's career center or professional development center, or perhaps with their study abroad global studies center, just to see if they have something like Going Global. So this is a subscription service. We at Smith have had this subscription for several years now. For any Smithies who are on the call, you can get to this through Handshake. Check in the Career Center resources section, and that's how you can get to Going Global through our subscription there. And this is really a fantastic resource for information about both the job search mechanics and processes and expectations and norms for countries around the world, and even countries and some specific cities as well, some city-specific information. How to find opportunities, what to expect in an interview process, what are examples of CVs and cover letters, and what does that look like? Major employers, great job search databases, how to find internships. This is a really, really powerful tool. And one of the reasons that we like this, that we recommend this, that we've invested in this for students is because it's data gathered through staff and contacts that that Going Global has partnered with in these countries. So it's people who have local and regional knowledge about that. So this could be a really, really good tool, or again, perhaps your own institution has a similar tool like Going Global if they don't have this, but I'd certainly invite you to contact your career staff and ask them about this. A few other things that could be useful as starting points. Again, you can look this up online and you might find 20 plus other resources for this. But just a few that I've found that might be good starting points. So the Balanced Careers is a very well-known site. They have some examples of some CVs. Transitionsabroad.com is another nice site that has a lot of good information about this and about people looking for opportunities outside of the US. All About Careers, this is a long-running career resource that includes some information about job seeking and CVs for international audiences as well. So again, this is not by no means the only places to look for this sort of information, but they might be good starting points to expand beyond some of the other ideas that I've shared with you today. Okay, so with that, what I would invite each of you to do here, just kind of as we're closing up in the last few moments, just for your own sort of thought process. This is nothing that you need to share through chat or anything like that. But just before we go, think about, was there anything through this presentation that you found helpful, that was kind of an aha moment for you? Anything that stood out for you? I'd invite you to just kind of think about that and kind of grab that, park that in your memory banks. And also, if there was anything in particular from this session that you want to take some action on in the next week or so, again, just kind of think about that. What is that? And I ask these questions or offer these prompts just as a way to encourage people to pay attention to sort of what's most useful and to kind of create that learning moment, because this is a lot of information from this session, maybe from other sessions you've been attending today. A lot of it can just kind of pass right through the memory banks. So if you can just take a moment and capture for yourself what you found useful, what was helpful, what stood out for you, that's going to help it help it stick in your memory. And then, before we close out, certainly I'm happy to do my best to address any other questions that you may have. So I'm happy to hang out here, monitor the chat for a few more minutes. But for anyone who is going to sign off, again, I want to just say thank you for joining today. I appreciate your attention, and I do hope this was a useful conversation, gave you some useful starting points for this process. So thank you, and have a great rest of your day.